Hey everyone, I'm Laura Forcum, president of the Independent Center, consumer psych PhD, and a former marketing professor.
I am Lauren Hall, professor of political science and author of the Substack, The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life.
This is We Made This Political, a podcast about making politics more about flourishing and less about power.
We talk about living together in communities, families, and as citizens. We're both drawing from our respective backgrounds in psychology and political science and as parents.
As parents. Everybody, I want to introduce you to Austen Campbell, who is our first guest on We Made This Political. And I'm so excited to talk with Austen today. He is the founder of the Independent National Coalition, doing some really interesting work to field independent candidates in a targeted and strategic way. He has previous campaign experience working with Dan Osborne, who was the independent candidate running for Senate in the state of Nebraska. So welcome, Austen. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast and being our first guest.
Yes, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Lauren. I'm excited to be here, chat with you about community and where we think independents fit into that narrative.
Awesome to have you. We have a lot of questions.
I'll bring the answers.
Okay.
I'll kick us off. Obviously, one of the things we talk about here is independent thinking in a community. If you could give us a little bit of background in terms of what drew you to the independent political space and what keeps you in it, especially now.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I feel like a lot of people are trying to figure out where their political home is right now with this shift in politics. For me, I always was drawn to politics, but I never really wanted to be that career politician that studied poli-sci and we got a job in politics and stayed the whole career. I always viewed it as a civil service type of thing, but it was when it was going to be Joe Biden versus Donald Trump again. And I was like, well, clearly something's broken if this is the best our political apparatuses have to offer, then something has to change. So I started looking into alternative politics in late 2023, early 2024, really starting to think about who was organizing it. Like if there's such a desire for alternatives, who's bringing that message? And what I really came to understand was it wasn't that there wasn't options. You have the older style third parties like the Green parties, the Libertarians. You have the Forward Party trying to modernize the idea of a third party. You have election reform trying to organize different ways of voting for alternatives, but no one was really organizing the larger ecosystem, and I recognize that if there's a DNC, organizing Democrats and the RNC organizing Republicans, why isn't there an INC organizing independents? So I just kind of branded us as the Independent National Coalition because I knew that we needed to do this together. It wasn't going to be one group of people or a select few organizations that did this, but the larger space could come together and really figure out how we get out of this entrenchment of the two-party system. And, that's what kind of keeps me here. And I think people are desiring for alternatives. So we'll see how we progress towards November 2026.
It's interesting you brought up right away the idea of coalition. I think one of the questions people have when I'm talking to them about the work of political independence is, well, if it's a coalition, how do you know who belongs and who doesn't? I think what they're actually asking is, what is the litmus test? In the parties, we could talk about what is the litmus test to be a Republican or a Democrat. At this point, I think the litmus test has gotten very self-referential in the two parties, right? It's like you are a Democrat to the extent that you agree with what the party says, the leadership of the party. You're a Republican to the extent that you endorse what Donald Trump says. And that's the extent of the litmus test. Do you think, as you're trying to think through what type of coalition partners to work with, and who belongs in this coalition, how do you think about who belongs? Do you think you need a litmus test? How do you think through that?
That's a great question in terms of the psychology of it all and where people fit on the political ideological spectrum. If you look at the litmus tests of the Democratic Party, I mean, you have like people like AOC being like, in any other country, me and Joe Biden would not be in the same political party. So it tells you that, yes, the Democrats have a large umbrella. Yes, the Republicans have a large umbrella, but that's because those are the only options. But Independents, we're now the plurality of the voting group. 34% of the people that voted in the last election cycle were not registered Democrat, were not registered Republican. So it becomes a thing of, okay, well, who are we? What is our identity? And I think the litmus test right now is the recognition that you can be your moral self, your ethical self. You can have your values, but you don't need to be part of the apparatus, the political system that's been offered to us that clearly isn't working. I almost look at David Hogg, where he's like, I'm going to run progressives $20 million against incumbent Democrats. And you got the DNC kind of revolting against that. My question to people like him is, well, David, if the party doesn't want you and your moral values and your ethical values and what you're fighting for wouldn't change, why not become an independent? Why have to fight for that party? You can always change it once you get into office. But the barriers to entry in our political system right now says that you have to go through the DNC or the RNC to gain power. And that's just not working because then they own you. If you run as a Democrat or if you run as a Republican and you gain the infrastructure and the donor base and, all of that, which comes with, joining forces with them, that's almost then becomes your ball and chain. Because then if you don't vote with them, like you were saying, okay, then they're going to primary you next year. They're going to take all that infrastructure and resources and donations and say, yeah, but we're going to give it to someone that actually will vote for us and won't kind of challenge us. So for me, I think the litmus test is you have to kind of suss out the morality and ethics. I stumble upon websites of some cuckoo people that are like, I'm going to be an independent. And it's like, all right, but those are the same people in the Republicans and Democratic parties as well. You always kind of have to suss that out. The people that see the two-party system is not really the best apparatus that we have right now, that is what I would consider the litmus test. If you're going to be able to gain our support and become an independent that we want to elevate to have a competitive race, you got to recognize that the incentives of the system aren't working, and that's why you're running. Not because you want to burn it down, not because you're an anarchist, not because you say, F the system. It's the system of government works. It's just the incentives of government right now are broken.
I have a follow-up question for both of you. I'm embarrassed to admit this as a political scientist because I should know more about this, but I don't. I'm just interested. I've long considered myself an independent. I voted third party or ticket split, done all of the things that independents often do, but I haven't considered myself part of like a movement. You might be losing me. Oh, you're back.
Never really
Okay,
fit. Go for it. Keep going. We got you now.
Okay. My question for you guys is where do you think the idea of, because it seems to me that all of a sudden, and I think we're seeing this because the two parties are internally
Imploding.
So it makes sense to me that all of a sudden people are like, let's see if there's an alternative. But I'm wondering if the idea of an independent coalition goes back further. And we've had lots of political realignments over the years, if that goes back 200 years. But I'm wondering if you see a specific inflection point over the last 10 or 15 years where all of a sudden it seemed like a lot of people were thinking about getting independent voters together in a meaningful way, or if it's been just a sort of organic kind of movement and growth of organizations and people like you two thinking and working in this space.
Laura, happy to go first? Or
Go for it. Go ahead.
I think from my perspective, it almost becomes the game of like, what is the top line conversation that's happening? On the surface, yes, there's a lot of organizations that are like, we need something different. We are going to start to figure out how to identify people that don't really fit into the system. But from the news narrative and the partisanship of the two parties, they've always treated independents as, at the end of the day, they're going to choose a side and it's ours or theirs. And as long as we are just less evil and less bad than the other side, they'll always consider us their choice. And like, they didn't really view independents as a different subset of the voter that is, not engulfed in this idea that the two parties are the only choices that we have. But yeah, when the power structure is, if I want to run for office in Illinois as a Democrat, I need to get 600 signatures roughly to get on the ballot. If I want to run as a Republican, I need 600 signatures roughly to get on the ballot. If I want to run as anything different, I need to get 12,000 signatures to get on the ballot. they say that nobody wants to run, alternative
Right.
options don't ever bubble up, but it's because you've put massive barriers to entry for any
Yep.
alternative. And that's why they can treat us like that, because at the end of the day, we got to vote R or D because those are the only choices. So that would be
Yeah.
my take on that.
That is an area of extreme bipartisan consensus. The two
Yeah.
parties agree that there should be no competition for them to field and support candidates. And so, yes, they've made it basically impossible. Then they declare, using their own research, that there's no interest from voters. And it's like you've stifled competition in this area. I look at it the same way that Austin does, which is we're not trying to burn down the system. We're trying to enfranchise voters who don't otherwise have a way to participate in civic life. And the other thing that I say a lot on behalf of the Independent Center is that we're not only talking to people who are going to vote third party. We want you to split ticket vote. We want you to swing vote. We want you to participate. And to the extent that you feel like there's no one for you because nobody's running under your party identification, that's one of the things we're really trying to work against, because really it's just like this increased competition. If you're a partisan, there's very little accountability because you're not going to switch parties unless something really extreme happens. So the parties love only having to deal with extreme partisans because you've got them. They're locked in. You're playing chess with the pieces nailed to the board. It's a very different game than if suddenly you have to start competing to win independence. And I think it's also really important to note that independents have delivered the presidential election in the past 3 elections. They swung for Donald Trump this time. Previously, it was Joe Biden. Prior to that, it was Donald Trump. If you can't win without winning over independents, then the political math starts to look very different. And you're actually going to have to show them something of value and then deliver it in order to get into office and remain there. And I think that is an underappreciated aspect of enfranchising independence.
So on that note, how do you vote? So I write a lot about moderation. Another sort of related word, I don't think it's the same exactly, but centrism. There's a lot of interest in centrism and moderation. And there's been a number of books over the last couple of years. So I think we're seeing this rise in interest in both independent voters and in moderation and centrism in the United States and in Europe. Austin, what do you see as the connection between moderation and centrism and independence or independent voting, broadly speaking? They're not the same thing, but they do seem to be related.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to define that from my perspective is your question is based on the difference between bipartisanship and nonpartisanship. The centrists, the moderates are the people that like the idea of the two-party system, but just want to get back to the days of working together a little bit more, working across the aisle, finding consensus, having their values, understanding that they like their party, but just want to kind of conform a little bit more to fixing problems. Where nonpartisanship is the idea that you don't have to always agree with your party to get things done. And the party system itself is not producing the results that we need. So maybe we need to try something different. When it comes to independence, I think we've been boxed in the center because people are like, oh, if you're an independent, you must be a moderate. It's like, well, no, not necessarily. Independents are all over the political ideological spectrum. You know, you have right-wing conservative independents, you have left-wing liberal independents that aren't Democrats or Republicans because they don't like the old guard of what's left over. This is the 3rd oldest Congress we've ever elected, only, after the last Congress and the Congress before.
Right.
This is just the old guard staying in there. And I think people are viewing the status quo as not being effective. And that's where I think you're seeing kind of this bubbling up of, resentment, anarchy, revolution type of talk, and not necessarily in a violent way per se, but just of like, what are we doing? Why are we continuing to conform to the politics of our parents when that type of political atmosphere got us into this, now closing on $40 trillion of debt with no relief towards that? Like, why do we have to continue to conform to the same system And I think that's a perspective from people all over the political ideology, not just the centrists. I think the centrists want to keep power, like the Mitt Romneys and the people that are just like, I can work across the aisle and that's okay. Where they're like, I like the party system, it works, and it keeps kind of the power centralized. Where the younger generation, yeah, we're more individualistic. Like we've grown up with create your own avatar, have your own user profile. Like it's ingrained into us that we should have our own things. But we are trying to figure out what is the community value there as well. How do we keep our individualism and work towards the betterment of ourselves while also making sure that the collective good, the collective society can also benefit? And that's where I think you're seeing a disconnect between the new uprising political generations and the old guard.
Yeah. So as a follow-up to that, I mean, I think a lot about, I'm in New York, and Andrew Cuomo was a sort of centrist Democrat who destroyed third-party voting during the pandemic. He was trying to punish the Working Families Party, and he annihilated the opportunity for third parties to get on the ballot. So it's really important not to confuse moderate or centrism in that sense, caring about enfranchising voters or getting out of party politics. And part of it is that New York state politics is just straight up machine politics. The whole point is to not give voters choice. But this goes to one of my goals in my writing, which is to rebrand moderation. I use the term radical moderation because I want to avoid exactly this definition of moderation that I think most people come down to, which is, moderation is sort of, you take wherever the RNC is right now and wherever the DNC is right now, and like moderation's sort of somewhere in the
Find
middle.
the middle, yeah.
And my perspective is like, if this is a crap position and this is a crap position, there's no reason that this isn't also a crap position. So why are we defining moderation as this thing right between two crap positions? So what we really need is principles to guide us toward what is actually a principled moderation or a principled centrism. And to me, I think that means sort of blowing up the system, not in the violent sense, but from an ideological perspective, being able to break out of these ideological boxes. Wait a second, right? I can think very clearly about immigration policy and criminal justice policy, and my positions may not align with either party, but I may have deep-seated principles that follow my beliefs through those two policy preferences. That, I think, is one of the big problems we have right now, the lack of choice, is that we've sort of bundled policy preferences into these two buckets, and they're really crappy buckets, right? And, I feel like you have to vote for the RNC if you care about immigration reform. That's a terrible set of trade-offs. You have to make that vote. So that, to me, I think rethinking, part of what I'm trying to do is rethinking moderation. There's a couple other folks, just and some other folks who are just trying to think about, like, how can we market moderation as something different? And maybe there's other way. I mean, there's all sorts of adjacent ideas, right? Like people talk about political pluralism, independence is another way to think about it. But getting away from that idea that we're just looking for this midpoint between two terrible positions.
Yeah. And it comes to the fact of like, problems are hard to solve. When a party gets into power, they're almost reluctant to solve it for fear of losing. I'll take the example of housing affordability. If a party gets into power and says housing is unaffordable and we need to make it more affordable, so we're going to build massively, that's going to bring down the price of housing, which is going to solve that problem. But if you bought a house and it's valued very high, you're going to probably be upset that the value of your house just got cut in half. So it depends on the perspective of the person that you're trying to help. And that's where parties are kind of just reluctant to do anything because they don't want to lose the power. They don't want to lose in the midterms. So without any sort of like, the solution of that isn't moderation. Well, maybe if we just do a little bit, it will be fine. Like our generation needs to solve some big issues. And those are going to be challenging conversations. And we're not going to be able to help everyone depending on the perspective. If you're a homeowner that bought a house at $700,000 and now it's worth 1.2, and then we build a bunch of houses in your community and it goes down to $500,000, you're going to be pretty pissed. We're coming up to the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. How do we declare our independence from this system so that we can start thinking about what America 2050 looks like, and how have we solved and how have we progressed towards those problem solvings without harming our citizens on the way to do that? And I think the party structure is so tit for tat they don't have the gumption to tackle those big problems because it would hurt their brand and their people. And it's just like, don't be moderate, because if you be moderate, you can't raise money off that. If you can be extreme and
Right.
yell at the other side, you can put a flyer out there that says, look at me fighting the bad guy, donate $5. Look at me being bipartisan,
Right.
donate $5. No one's
Yeah.
raising money off that, you know? So it's the
Yeah.
incentives of the system that's broken. And that's where moderation, like, it's a bad word for independence, because I think we're just people that want to solve problems because we're sick of
Yeah.
how the system has attempted to solve problems and it's clearly not working. So it's just alternative. You know, we're not moderate, we're not centrist, we're not purple. You know, we're not saying that we need to like form this big middle ball. We're just saying the system as it is right now is captured and we need to find a way out of it. And by doing that, that just means you don't have to have a party boss to be a good politician. You don't need to have a corporate donor to have good economic idea. Like
Mhm.
that's all independence should really stand for, is I want to do my civic duty and I want to make sure that my generations and the generations that come after me do better than what I'm having to experience. And that's why I'm getting into it, not to be a Democrat for the sake of being a Democrat, you know?
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's kind of getting into the question of what is the independent identity. I really like that you described it as, I want to see smart solutions, right? Smart, thoughtful policies. I spend a lot of time interviewing independents and doing focus groups with independents. And one of the things that's really notable about them is that they think really deeply and carefully about policy issues. They think about
Yeah.
trade-offs. They think about how we prioritize, right? And so what you're really getting from them, the desire to have some consensus where we need to come together. This is something that Lauren and I have touched on a little bit, that policymaking is how we, living in community, sort out our values, right? We have people with different values, we have people with different needs, and we make policy to say, these are the things that are most important. These are the things that we can live without. Here's what we do with our resources to make life better than it could otherwise be. And so this like consensus building process, I think, is actually, we do it everywhere, right? Like you do it at work, you do it in your family, you do it in your community. It's just when we get to national politics or state house politics where it's winner take all. Now
Yeah.
it's I win, you lose. I think that's a shift from how it was 30 years ago. I think it's really bad for us. And I think that, like, rather than, this point you're making about this sort of mushy middle of moderates, it's not that these voters are telling you they have centrist moderate views. What they're telling you is they would like a process by which we get people's views to meet and have consensus, but not that they live in the middle. It's not that they're so much interested in a single idea. They're interested in a process that is more collaborative and
Yeah.
competitive. And so that's what I kind of see as the larger identity. But I'm wondering, what do you guys, Austin, I know you spend a lot of time thinking about this. Lauren, do you have thoughts about what is the real identity there for independence?
I do less thinking about this space in terms of the identity of independence broadly, but I think the language that you both have pointed to is where I see myself fitting, and like where I think the concept that I'm playing with, radical moderation, I think fits with the vision of independence that you all are building. It comes down to that issue of problem solving. I think we're starting to see that language used a lot more, and that gives me a lot of hope. When you look at the Problem Solvers Caucus or solutions journalism, right? There's all these movements in the media, in the political space, in bottom up, right? Like urban rural action. There's a number of organizations that really focus on like, hey, let's get a bunch of people who disagree together and solve tangible problems. Like, let's figure this out. And the process is going to be exactly the one that Laura pointed to, which is you're going to get a bunch of people together who agree that like, oh, this bridge is broken. And they're all going to have different ideas about how to fix it. The goal is going to be, okay, let's not like, we don't all have to like sit in a circle and like commune at the soul level. All we have to do is come to some agreement on how to fix the bridge. And I think that's actually a much more optimistic view of what politics can be, because it doesn't assume we're all going to have the same religious beliefs or the same view of the perfect nation or anything like that. All it is let's see if we can get some smart people in a room together and figure out what's a common sense immigration policy. And of course, the reality is that we have lots of examples of this. I mean, if you like poll Americans on like what abortion policy should look like, it's a pretty common sense abortion policy. 70% of Americans agree on, but we don't get it because we're stuck in this two-party system. So the two-party system actually prevents us from getting solutions. And this, I guess, is another question for you guys in terms of, and again, I think I know Laura's answer to this, but I hear a lot of focus from the political science perspective of how do we reform the electoral system? How do we reform primaries? So it's all these mechanistic kinds of things. But as Laura has pointed out a number of times, there's no appetite for those. If you're entrenched as a two-party person, you're not going to support those at baseline. I see the most hope in this bottom-up bubbling that's happening. And people who are really interested in solution finding, there's a lot less toxic polarization in local politics than in national politics. So there's a lot of hope there. I glommed on to the word that you guys have both been using, which was solutions, right? Like finding solutions to problems. And that is something that I think you could get independents on, you could get a lot of moderates on, you could get centrists in on, but they can't be wedded to the party structure. And that's where I think we have some real issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and I love that you said that because, and I talked to the reform movement a ton, and that's the open primaries, the ranked choice voting people. All of their efforts in 2024 got slapped down. Within the party, you don't want it because it starts to devalue your power. And even independents don't really vote for it because the parties can easily persuade you that it's going to tip the favor to the opposite side you don't like. And both parties do it. In Colorado, you had the Democrats and the Republicans saying ranked choice voting's evil, open primary's evil, don't do it. It's going to make it easier for the other side. And the other side is so like, who is that? But as long as that narration's getting out there, people get scared and they don't know how to vote for it. You need people to show the vision of America that they want. I mean, that's the Dan Osborne race. The Dan Osborne race wasn't go vote for me because I'm going to change the election laws to make sure more people like me get in. It's vote for me because I probably have your values more than she does. I am not a career politician. I didn't come up with money or wealth and fame. I am a union guy and I'm going to fight for union people and workers like you. And that's why you should vote for me. I mean, that is what America is going to follow into the next chapter of the political. I'm a believer that election reform and changing the mechanics of it all is important. But until we show what that means and who that results into, I think it's a fool's errand to continue to pump. There was $100 million pumped into election reform last election cycle for zero results. That's a lot of money pumped into something that got zero results. And it's like, okay, how do we continue to think about reform and building something that's going to represent us more? I think it's electing morally aligned people that represent us, but are also willing to go to the federal seats and say, I'm willing to solve problems. I'm willing to make sure that we come to a consensus in a general reality that some states have a higher GDP than other states. How do we balance that? Infrastructure between states is this. How do we think about America in the next 25 years that we are once again in a position to have a booming middle class? How do we take this idea of a 2-year, 4-year cycle and say, let's build for the next 25 years to make sure that we're getting there? I mean, this is not going to be easy solutions, but it's the people that's going to lead into that next vision. Then you can shore up the election cycle and the mechanics of it all with changes from there. But you got to get inspiring people to inspire people.
So I have a follow-up question. This goes back to your first comment when we started this episode, which was you were interested in politics as civil service as opposed to a profession. That has been a huge shift, right? I mean, so, I study the founding. We saw a very clear conversation at the founding about whether you wanted professional politicians, and everyone was like, no professional politicians. Now we clearly have a ruling class, or people who have been in office forever. So there's this chicken and egg problem, right? Part of the reason that's happening is that elections have gotten so wildly expensive, so people can't enter. There's lots of other causation as well. I'm just wondering what you see as disruption points to that. How do we shift it away from these people who think about politics as a profession, something that they're going to get good at? Because those are the people who keep the political machine running, as opposed to people who see this as maybe I'll drop into politics for 2, 4 years, 6 years, and then drop back again. I don't know how you do that. Yeah.
If you think about the image of Dianne Feinstein, right? Like, I was worried she was going to die on the Senate floor.
Everybody was worried she was going to die. That was crazy.
But like, if you, this is what one of the things that I'm sorry to jump in, Austin.
Writing some thoughts down.
I think that if that doesn't awaken you to the idea that the incentives to remain in office are concerning, I don't know what will, right? Like, any normal person doesn't want to be on their deathbed on the Senate floor. We should all be concerned about people who have been in office for 20 and 30 years, right? Like, that's not good. To me, the only explanation for that is that the power is impossible to resist, right? The money is impossible to resist. The need to be powerful and relevant is impossible to resist. And that should concern all of us. And so I think trying to get closer to this norm of public service, it's duty, right? Like, you are trying to contribute something valuable to your community. And I realize it sounds very idealistic, but, focus on something other than power and money and access. I think it's so hard for a normal person to relate to what is keeping career politicians in office. And that in itself should be a flag that something there is very unhealthy.
When I first started this journey, and I guess maybe even before, I was in the same boat. I feared the career politicians, but know what I fear more? Celebrity politicians. And that's what I think we're moving into, this idea that you can just become famous on Instagram or TikTok. Like, the opposite sides of the spectrums are AOC and Marjorie Taylor Greene. They don't need the party infrastructure anymore to continue winning their seats for the next 50 years. They have enough small dollar donations and enough clout on social media in their ecosystems that they don't need the DNC and RNC to tell them anything. They could win time and time again. And that's a model that people are starting to recognize as successful. So that's kind of where, to your point, how do you get it back to civic duties, moral candidates coming up and not these civic duties? But I think it becomes like you have the machine, you have the candidates, ebb and flow. But then you have, to some credit of this idea, you have professional staff that make a career out of it. You have think tanks, policy think tanks, and consultants and lobbyists that make a career out of it. You have legislative aides. There's a whole ecosystem of what is a career politician. I mean, that's all of it in my mind. I don't think you'll ever get rid of it. And there's value in the idea that somebody or a group of people do know how to run the government. When a new administration gets elected and they go in, they got to hire a bunch of people to run the White House. That's not an easy task. You better have someone with 10 years of experience to be able to run the office of whatever, because it's going to be a daunting task. So yes, we need to make sure that our government doesn't just wipe out the ruling class and put in brand new green thumb politicians to start running on the global stage. It's a conversation of term limits. What does that look like? How do we make sure that it is kind of a turnover that new generations are able to come into the conversation?
Well, and this is so this is partly the, as a political scientist, my frustration with the current drain the swamp tactics is like, it's the wrong swamp, guys. Like, we're not, like, this is not the swamp that needs to be drained, right? Like, draining, deep knowledge from the, this doesn't mean that, like, the executive agencies don't need reform, but that's not the swampy part. We do have some awesome questions. Michael Evans has an awesome question in the chat. Do you all think greater reliance on citizens' assemblies could help us get policy that is both better representative of the supermajority and more deliberative? I love that question. I don't know if you guys want to take a stab at it.
I was at the American Democracy Summit in Arizona last week. Citizens' assemblies was a huge conversation. They're hard to put on. They cost a lot of money. and you can make it a little bit more effective, but they're a great way to get, a large swath of the ideological spectrum, socioeconomical spectrum to come in and have a deliberation on a specific topic or policy point. I think that is a brilliant way to start thinking about it forward. As we understand this technological revolution that we're in, there has to be a conversation of updating our democracy for the 21st century to make sure that our politicians understand the true nature of what their constituencies want, and not this older style of, well, we elect you on this issue, but like now this issue's up and you're not taking our opinions at all. So citizens assemblies are a great way to get citizens more involved into that process.
I think it's a really interesting question of how you get that type of participation. There are a lot of barriers to people who are, say, lower socioeconomic status participating in a conversation like that. If you are working a full-time in-person job and dealing with childcare, that is extremely challenging from a logistical standpoint. And then there's other barriers too, like speaking the language, feeling like your ideas are valid and relevant, and feeling like you're informed enough to comment. I think it's possible that technology can offer us ways to do better at making sure that we're getting those views represented because, and in democracy, anywhere you go, right, there's a selection effect in your data collection, which is that you will systematically miss some observations that are relevant to how you understand the picture of what's happening. And so one of my sort of questions is, how do we capture all of that stuff? And I think it's really important to keep in mind that capturing the experience of the entire swath of citizenry is really important. And that's a lot more possible than getting all of those people to weigh in on what policy you need. If you tell me what the problems are that you're dealing with, I can start to come up with policy solutions that speak to those rather than saying, come to me with ideas about how we reform something as complex as Medicaid or Medicare or Social Security, right? It's like, no, just talk to me about what's going on. Because I think a lot of those things are surprising to people who are not as in touch with a working class, lower education level, lower socioeconomic status day to day.
Yeah, I think there's some solutions in there. When we were talking to the people that run them with ADS, a lot of them were like, they're expensive because we pay our participants to come. So it kind of helps overcome that like socioeconomical, like if you can't take 4 days off of work to deliberate on a policy because you need to get paid, that becomes a problem. Some of them, I can't speak for all of them, but some of them will pay a stipend, a living cost or whatever. The selection process is huge. How do you make sure you're getting enough applicants to the process when you select your whatever, how many you end up inviting? It does speak to the breadth of it. And then I think the complexities of an issue can depend on the effectiveness of the assembly. Like if you're doing a statewide thing to talk about one bill that the representative may or may not vote on, is that a cost-effective way? Or is this more for ballot initiatives like election reform, open primaries, ranked choice voting, and proportional representation? Let's bring in the larger constituency, hash it out, and then present one bill that everyone can agree to. So I think depending on the question, the effectiveness of those processes can be good or bad.
And Michael had a follow-up that he'd like to see the assembly's focus on institutional reforms, which I think is amazing. I totally agree with Laura that if you're asking people about the intricacies of immigration policy or housing policy, my area, which is healthcare policy, I have a PhD and had to ask lobbyists to help me understand Medicare because I couldn't read the bills themselves.
Training and how they can obscure the words. Like,
yes. No,
you
that,
know, oh,
that I
yeah,
think
we ought to, we really.
yes, I think that was most of it. If you had asked New Yorkers from every single partisan, ideological, socioeconomic perspective, should we have third parties on the ballot? The answer would have overwhelmingly been, of course we should, right? But Cuomo made that decision almost unilaterally with the support of the assembly, I think. And, so he just, without any reference. And so I think we actually could ask citizens assemblies to tackle some of these institutional reform questions, because I don't think you need as much specialized knowledge I also think it's less manipulatable. One of the things we know about ballot initiatives is that you can change a single word and completely shift how people think about it. Framing effects are really hard. Whereas I think there's a lot of hope if you're just asking people like, hey, how much access do you want all of these gatekeeping measures? Do you support them or not? And I think most people would say, of course not. So that I think is a great suggestion. Thanks, Michael.
It just comes down to re-understanding what government is supposed to be. Government is just us collectively deciding how we want our society to be governed. At the end of the day, we need to come together and say, how do we want to perform elections? It was written 250 years ago how they should be, but now we have empirical evidence on does it work or does it not work, and where is the manipulation factor in that? How do we take that empirical evidence and say, we got to tweak it this, and this so that the next 250 years, we don't run into the same problems? That's all the conversation boils down to.
I think there's some amazing perspective sharing that could happen in a citizen assembly. I can see an upper middle class white person thinking, well, of course you should have an ID to vote. And then if they're talking to a lower income person who maybe has had trouble in the past with the DNB or can't wait in line for an hours, all the barriers that we know exist. They don't have a driver's license. I've seen over and over again how many times people are just like, oh, I didn't realize that barrier existed.
Yeah.
Maybe we do need a different way of thinking about voting. You can talk to them about the evidence about voter fraud, which is very minor, but that's not the data that's going to convince them. It's the story of the person who had barriers that they couldn't imagine because they don't live in that world. That's another benefit, I think, is that you get people from very different backgrounds together, and then they can say, this was my experience trying to get a government ID.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
Or
I think
even the
this is
circumstances of just like losing your wallet a week before election. Even the simplistic versions of not this whole complex, I needed to go to the government to do this, but like, oh man, my passport expired because I haven't traveled outside the country in the last X amount of years. And I literally lost my wallet last week. Now I can't vote because of circumstance. Like, that's ridiculous, you know?
Yeah. In my previous life, when I was in college and in graduate school, I spent a lot of time working in the criminal justice system on the defense side. That meant I have spent more time in jail and prison than probably anybody you know. One of the things I tell people is, and this makes me sound very radical, if you are an advocate of those systems, you should spend time in them. You should see what a locked psychiatric ward in Cook County Jail looks like. I can't do it justice if I explain it, right? And so I feel like we have a lot of people advocating for policy solutions, especially related to crime and immigration, where they've never been on the receiving end of those things. And it's dehumanizing, it's disempowering, it's anti-democratic in some cases, it's violating the Constitution in others, right? And like, I think you should see what those are like. So that maybe is my plug for even more than a citizen assembly, right? Like I'd like more people to see what these systems are like. Go see what it's like to try and get signed up for welfare. Go see what it's like to try and get onto food stamps. I know we're coming to the end of the hour and this has been a great conversation, but one of the questions like I really want to hear the answer to, because we have a focus in this podcast on parenting. Austen, I want to know, how did your parents raise you that you turned into a guy who's like, you know what, I like independent parties and I like independence so much that I'm going to implode American political life myself in a good way. Were you a difficult child? No, I'm kidding.
That is an interesting question. I am the second oldest, so I'm the second boy. I've got two younger sisters as well. So there's something to say about the second born always being more of the rebellious one, I guess. I don't know if it's more of a parental question than it is a generational question, you know? And I think that's something that our generations and the younger generations are going to have to grapple with. We are a relatively new society. This is the first time that we're able to FaceTime people across the globe and have a split-second differential in our conversation. Communication structure is different. Factual realities are different. We are evolving through a world and a media landscape that can be confusing. The world isn't a fair place, but it's also not this disastrous, horrendous vision that sometimes online can portray. even when online is trying to portray a great vision of like, here's all the fun life and adventure you can have. If you're not economically accessible to that, you almost get hurt more because you're seeing all these 18-year-olds driving Ferraris and being like, yeah, I just became famous on TikTok and that's how I make my living now. And it's like, to kind of wrap it back into politics and independent politics, there's a lot of questions and decision making from a parental perspective in the next couple of cycles that we're going to have to grapple with, like the impact of technology on society. I mean, you have Australia already banning social media for anyone under the age of 16. We're going to get some results from that over the next couple of years to see if that improved the mental health of young kids. Like, I think that's the questions that the two-party system isn't going to be able to answer because of the entrenchment of power, the entrenchment of tech now controlling that power. I mean, before it used to be energy and resources, but now it's Silicon Valley, the hedge fund managers, the lobbyists to make sure that AI regulations are down and crypto regulations are down and social media regulations are down. Those are the problems that I think we're going to have to grapple with as parents of the next generation. We were kind of that bridge between analog and digital, where I still remember having to dial into the internet.
Right.
And 64, the regular Nintendo, that's what I grew up with. And now all kids know is like VR. So it's like, there's a lot of things that I think we're going to have to grapple with, and politics is going to have to play a role in that. And that's where I think independence from the system that's controlled, the incentives that's controlled by the money and the lobbyists and all of that, is going to have to get like unlodged for society to really start to figure out who we are and who we want to be in the next generations.
Yeah. So we have 1 minute left. We like to end on a high note. I would like to hear from you what's giving you hope this week or what you're optimistic about.
I was super excited to have this conversation. You know, me and Laura had been talking for a couple of months now at this point. I think we've known each other. I'm a conversationalist. I'm not great at just hopping on TikTok and being like, listen to me, I'm going to tell you what's what. I like these conversations because they are deliberative. They get to the core of what people are feeling rather than what people want to just tell you. I always look forward to conversations like these, especially that I know your podcast is focused on community, because that's what I think we need to get back to. Individualism, great. You know, the nuclear family, yes, it has evolved over the last couple of years, but like community driven is going to be huge. And that's what I think these conversations really start to encourage people to get out there and have not hard conversations, but just like, what world do you want to live in? Yes, here's the world that exists, but what world do we want to live in? And how do we make sure that we take every day and every opportunity to grow in that direction? You know, and that's what I'm always excited about through my weeks, having these conversations. We're lifting up the spirit and showing that, yes, politics is a little bit decisive, very partisan, but there are people out there looking to drive more community values, more deliberative discussions to get us in a direction that makes sense. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah.
I've been really excited for.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you for coming on. What's giving me optimism this week is Boz wrote in the comments, this is one of the best talks I've ever heard on Substack, and there should be 1 million people in here. Fantastic stuff, folks.
Appreciate that, Beth.
Thank you. So, Laura, I don't know if you have something that was mine, but that could be yours too. It's hard to top that. I'm going to go with that.
Awesome.
You. Yeah. Well, thank you, Austen,
thanks,
again.
Michael.
And thank you, everyone who came on. And thank you to Michael and Baz and Carol and all the folks in the comments. This was a fantastic conversation. I had a blast. I hope to have many more. Thanks,
All right.
everyone. Have a
Thanks,
great day.
everyone.
Bye.